Hey there, night owls and insomniacs. If you're here because you can't sleep and need a good story to drift off to, well, you might want to reconsider this one. Because tonight, we're diving into medical history so disgusting it might actually keep you awake. Imagine going to the doctor and being prescribed literal human waste, or having holes drilled in your skull to cure a headache. Welcome to the nightmare that was historical medicine, where the cure was often worse than the disease. Now, before we dive into this absolute horror show of human medical innovation, let me ask you something. What's the worst medicine you've ever had to take? Was it that awful tasting cough syrup your mom forced down your throat as a kid? Maybe some bitter antibiotics that made your stomach turn? Perhaps that chalky antacid that felt like drinking liquid concrete? Well, congratulations, because compared to what we're about to explore, your worst medical experience was basically a luxury spa treatment. We're talking about an era when doctors thought the best way to cure a fever was to drain half your blood until you passed out, when pharmacists genuinely believed that grinding up Egyptian mummies and mixing them with honey would cure your ailments, and when the standard medical advice for pretty much everything from headaches to heartbreak was, "Have you tried eating poop?" And no, I'm not exaggerating for dramatic effect. That was literally documented medical advice prescribed by respected physicians for centuries. Think about it for a moment. We live in an age where we complain about waiting too long at the doctor's office, or having to take a pill that tastes slightly chalky, or getting a shot that stings for 2 seconds. Meanwhile, our ancestors were lining up to drink urine cocktails served in fancy goblets, getting amateur brain surgery performed with rusty tools in dirty taverns by men who learned their trade from watching other drunk guys do it, and paying good money for the privilege of being tortured in the name of healthcare. The sheer audacity and confidence of historical medicine is absolutely mind-blowing when you really think about it. These weren't random crazy people making stuff up in their basement laboratories. These were the most respected physicians, scholars, and healers of their time, men who studied at the finest universities, who wrote detailed medical treatises about why you should definitely put mercury directly in your mouth, or why bleeding yourself into near death was the absolute height of medical sophistication. They had fancy degrees, impressive titles, and the complete trust of their communities. And here's the truly wild part that'll make your brain hurt. People actually got better sometimes, purely by accident or because the human body is incredibly resilient, which only reinforced these absolutely insane practices in the minds of practitioners. Imagine being a medieval doctor who just prescribed someone a cocktail of human feces mixed with wine and herbs, and then the patient actually recovers from their illness. You'd think you were an absolute genius, right? You'd be writing medical papers about the miraculous healing properties of waste management, teaching it to your students, and charging premium prices for your revolutionary fecal therapy treatments. This is exactly how we ended up with centuries upon centuries of medical practices that would make a modern horror movie writer pause and say, "Okay, that might be too disturbing for audiences, let's tone it down a bit." The medical profession spent hundreds of years essentially conducting the most elaborate torture experiments on human beings, all while convinced they were performing acts of healing and mercy. So buckle up tight, because over the next hour and a half, we're going to take a journey through the absolute worst, most disgusting, and most horrifying examples that human medical creativity has to offer. We'll meet doctors who thought the solution to mental illness was scrambling your brain with an ice pick through your eye socket, physicians who prescribed radioactive water as a daily health tonic, surgeons who believed that the best anesthesia was a wooden stick to bite down on while they sawed off your limbs, and healers who were convinced that the path to wellness ran directly through a patient's digestive system via the most unappetizing route possible. By the time we're done with this medical nightmare tour, you'll either have developed a profound newfound appreciation for modern medicine and evidence-based healthcare, or you'll be so thoroughly grossed out that you'll never want to see a doctor again, which, given what we're about to discover, might actually have been the statistically safer option for most of human history. Ready to dive into the beautiful nightmare of medical history? Let's begin with a time when medicine was less about healing and more about seeing how many creative ways humans could torture each other in the name of health. To understand just how spectacularly wrong historical medicine got everything, we need to step back and picture a world where nobody, and I mean absolutely nobody, had any clue how the human body actually worked. Imagine trying to fix a computer when you think it runs on magic and fairy dust instead of electricity and code. That was basically the entire medical profession for most of human history. We're talking about civilizations that could build massive pyramids, create incredible works of art, and develop complex mathematical systems, but when it came to understanding what was happening inside their own bodies, they were basically making educated guesses based on what things looked like from the outside. The ancient Greeks, who we often think of as the founders of rational thought and scientific inquiry, came up with the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. According to this brilliant medical philosophy, every single illness, every disease, every health problem you could possibly have was caused by having too much or too little of one of these bodily fluids. Got a headache? Too much blood in your head. Feeling sad? Obviously too much black bile. Running a fever? Definitely an excess of yellow bile that needs to come out immediately. It was like having a medical system designed by someone who only understood the human body through the lens of a medieval cooking recipe. And here's the kicker, this wasn't just some fringe theory that a few crazy doctors believed. This was the dominant medical philosophy for over 2,000 years. 2,000 years. That's longer than Christianity has existed. Imagine if we were still using Windows 95 because everyone was convinced it was the pinnacle of computer technology and refused to consider that maybe, just maybe, there might be better options available. The Romans, who conquered half the known world and built engineering marvels that still stand today, were completely convinced that the best way to maintain good health was through bloodletting, purging, and vomiting. They had public bathhouses with sophisticated heating systems, aqueducts that supplied fresh water to entire cities, and roads so well built that we still use the phrase, "all roads lead to Rome," but their medical advice was essentially, "Have you tried throwing up more?" And it wasn't just the lack of anatomical knowledge that made historical medicine so horrifying, it was the complete absence of any concept of germs, bacteria, or infection. These brilliant civilizations had no idea that invisible tiny creatures were constantly trying to kill them. They thought diseases were caused by bad air, angry gods, moral failings, or celestial alignments. When the Black Death swept through Europe and killed a third of the population, the medical establishment's response was to recommend prayer, bloodletting, and avoiding looking at sick people too directly because they thought illness could be transmitted through your eyes. They were living in a world where they could predict eclipses and navigate by the stars, but they thought you could catch the plague by making eye contact with a sick person. The medieval period was especially creative in its medical ignorance. European physicians were convinced that studying actual human bodies was morally wrong and offensive to God, so they based all their anatomical knowledge on dissecting pigs and assuming humans worked the same way. This led to centuries of medical textbooks that were basically pig anatomy guides with human labels slapped on them. Imagine going to medical school and learning that humans have curly tails and hooves, and then wondering why your patients aren't responding well to treatments designed for farm animals. Meanwhile, in other parts of the world, different cultures were developing their own equally creative ways to completely misunderstand human biology. Traditional Chinese medicine decided that the body was governed by mysterious energy flows called qi, and that illness was caused by blockages in these invisible energy highways. Islamic physicians were convinced that mental illness was caused by jinn possession and that the best treatment was to make the patient's body so uncomfortable that the evil spirits would leave voluntarily. Egyptian doctors thought the heart was the center of intelligence and that the brain was just useless stuffing, which explains why they threw away the brains during mummification but carefully preserved every other organ. Every civilization, independently and with complete confidence, came up with elaborate medical systems that were wrong about literally everything important about how bodies work. Now let's dive deeper into the most beloved medical practice of all time, the art of literally draining the life out of people and calling it healthcare. If the four humors theory was the Windows 95 of medical philosophy, then bloodletting was definitely the Internet Explorer. Everyone used it for way too long, it never actually worked properly, and it probably caused more problems than it solved. But unlike Internet Explorer, bloodletting could actually kill you, which makes it significantly worse than slow web browsing. The basic premise of bloodletting was beautifully simple in its complete wrongness. If you're sick, it's because you have too much blood, so obviously the solution is to get rid of some of that excess blood until you feel better. It's like thinking your car is running poorly because there's too much gas in the tank, so you drain half the fuel and wonder why it stops working entirely. Medieval physicians were absolutely obsessed with blood. They thought it was the root cause of everything from headaches to heartbreak, and their solution was always the same: more bloodletting. Got a fever? Time for some bloodletting. Feeling depressed? Definitely need to drain some blood. Broken leg? Well, that's obviously caused by too much blood rushing to the injury site, so let's bleed you until you forget about the pain because you're too weak to feel anything. The confidence these doctors had in bloodletting was truly inspiring in the most terrifying way possible. They developed an entire elaborate science around it, with detailed charts showing exactly which veins to cut for specific ailments, how much blood to drain based on the patient's age and condition, and complex astrological calculations to determine the optimal bleeding times. It was like astrology and butchery had a baby and somehow convinced everyone it was medicine. They had special bloodletting calendars that showed the best days for bleeding based on lunar cycles, because apparently the moon had strong opinions about when you should voluntarily lose large amounts of blood. The tools of the trade were equally impressive in their medieval brutality. Physicians used everything from sharp knives to specially designed bleeding cups, but the real stars of the bloodletting world were leeches. Yes, actual living worms that they would stick all over your body to suck your blood. Imagine walking into a doctor's office today and being told that the best treatment for your migraine is to have a bunch of slimy parasites attached to your forehead. Medieval patients were paying good money for the privilege of becoming human juice boxes for hungry worms. The leech business was so popular that there were professional leech collectors who would wade into swamps and rivers, letting leeches attach to their legs, then selling these blood-hungry creatures to physicians. It was basically like being a vampire farmer, except instead of dramatic Gothic castles, you worked in disgusting marshlands and your product had a tendency to escape and attach itself to random body parts. Barber surgeons, who were the Walmart of medieval healthcare, would display their bloody bandages outside their shops like some kind of horrifying advertisement. Come on in for a shave and a bloodletting. We'll make you look good and feel terrible. These weren't even real doctors. They were literally barbers who decided to expand their business model from cutting hair to cutting people. Would you trust your local hair cuttery to perform surgery? Because that's essentially what medieval people were doing every day. The amount of blood they would drain was absolutely insane by any reasonable standard. We're talking about removing pints of blood from people who were already sick and weak. It was like trying to help someone who's drowning by removing all the water from the pool while they're still in it. Physicians would literally bleed patients until they fainted, and then they'd congratulate themselves on a job well done because the patient was obviously feeling so much better that they'd relaxed into unconsciousness. George Washington, one of the most important figures in American history, was probably killed by bloodletting. When he got sick with a throat infection, his doctors drained over 5 pints of blood from him in less than 24 hours. For reference, the average human body contains about 10 pints of blood total, so they removed half of his blood supply to treat what was basically a sore throat. It's like trying to fix a small oil leak in your car by draining the entire engine. The man survived crossing the Delaware River in the middle of winter during a war, but he couldn't survive his own doctors trying to help him with what modern medicine would cure with some throat lozenges and maybe an antibiotic. But wait, it gets worse. Because if bleeding yourself half to death wasn't horrifying enough, historical medicine had another brilliant solution that makes bloodletting look like a spa treatment: drinking your own urine. Yes, you heard that correctly. For thousands of years, respected physicians across multiple civilizations looked at human waste and thought, you know what? That looks refreshing and medicinal. Welcome to the wonderful world of urotherapia, where the medical advice was literally, have you tried drinking your own pee? And doctors said it with a straight face while charging patients money for this revolutionary wisdom. The ancient Romans were absolutely convinced that urine was nature's perfect medicine. Roman physicians would prescribe fresh morning urine for everything from eye infections to digestive problems, and they had the audacity to call it liquid gold. And I mean, technically they weren't wrong about the color, but calling urine liquid gold is like calling garbage aromatic treasure. It's creative marketing at its finest. Roman soldiers were told to drink their own urine to prevent scurvy during long campaigns, which means the mighty Roman Empire was powered by men who thought the secret to good health was turning themselves into human recycling systems. Can you imagine being a Roman general giving pre-battle speeches? Men, remember to stay hydrated. And by hydrated, I mean drink your own waste products and then charge into battle. The Chinese took urine therapy to a whole new level of disgusting sophistication. Traditional Chinese medicine didn't just recommend drinking any old urine. Oh no, that would be too simple. They had elaborate classifications for different types of urine based on the age, gender, and health status of the person producing it. Urine from young virgin boys was considered the premium grade medicine, which raises so many uncomfortable questions about ancient Chinese medical practices that I don't even want to think about the logistics involved. They actually had urine sommeliers who could allegedly taste test different samples and determine their medicinal properties. Imagine having professional pee taster as your job title and trying to explain that at dinner parties. Medieval European physicians were equally enthusiastic about urine, but they approached it with their typical medieval flair for making everything unnecessarily complicated and gross. They developed something called uroscopy, which was basically fortune-telling with pee. Doctors would examine the color, smell, taste, and consistency of patients' urine and claim they could diagnose any illness just by analyzing waste products. They had elaborate charts showing different urine colors and what diseases they supposedly indicated. It was like a medical mood ring, except instead of changing colors based on your temperature, it was just your body's way of getting rid of things it didn't want. And yes, I said taste. Medieval doctors were literally tasting their patients' urine as part of the diagnostic process. Before diabetes had a name, physicians would taste urine to detect sweetness, which they correctly identified as a sign of illness but for completely wrong reasons. Imagine going to medical school and having to take a class called Advanced Urine Tasting 101, where you learned proper sampling techniques and flavor profiles. The professor would be standing there with a serious expression saying, "Now class, this sample has notes of kidney dysfunction with hints of bladder infection. Can anyone identify the underlying pathology?" Indian Ayurvedic medicine also jumped on the urine bandwagon with enthusiasm, recommending it for skin conditions, digestive issues, and general health maintenance. They called it Shivambu, which translates to water of Shiva, because apparently even ancient gods were into urine therapy. The practice involved not just drinking your own urine, but also using it for massage therapy and skin treatments. So not only were people drinking their own waste, they were also rubbing it all over their bodies like some kind of horrifying spa treatment. The confidence ancient physicians had in urine therapy was absolutely staggering. They wrote detailed medical texts explaining the proper techniques for urine collection, storage, and consumption. There were specific instructions about drinking it fresh versus aged, whether to dilute it with water or herbs, and complex dosing schedules based on the patient's condition. It was like they were describing fine wine instead of bodily waste. Some physicians even recommended drinking other people's urine for certain conditions, which takes the concept of personalized medicine to a whole new level of disgusting. But here's the thing that really makes your brain hurt. This wasn't just some fringe practice by a few crazy doctors. Urine therapy was mainstream medicine practiced by respected physicians and recommended in official medical textbooks for over 2,000 years. Now, if drinking urine wasn't quite horrifying enough for you, let's talk about what happened when ancient physicians decided that the problem with sick people was that they had too much pressure in their heads, and the obvious solution was to grab a drill and start making holes in their skulls. Welcome to trepanation, the medical practice that took the phrase, "open your mind," way too literally. This wasn't just a weird thing that happened once or twice in history, this was a popular medical procedure that was performed across virtually every civilization for thousands of years, which means that for most of human history, the standard medical advice for headaches, mental illness, seizures, and basically any brain-related problem was, let's see what happens if we drill a hole in your head and let the bad stuff out. The logic behind trepanation was beautifully simple in that special way that only completely wrong ideas can be. Ancient physicians observed that people with head injuries sometimes had their skulls crack open, and occasionally these people would survive and seem to feel better afterward. So naturally, they concluded that the skull was like a pressure cooker, and that mental illness, headaches, and seizures were caused by evil spirits, bad humors, or excess pressure that needed to be released through strategically placed holes. It's like thinking that the best way to fix a flat tire is to poke more holes in it until the air pressure equalizes. The tools used for trepanation were exactly as terrifying as you'd expect from a procedure that involves drilling into someone's head with medieval technology. We're talking about sharp stones, primitive metal drills, and saws that looked like they were designed by someone who had never actually seen a human skull before. Ancient surgeons would use everything from sharpened flint to crude bronze instruments, and the anesthesia was usually just a stick to bite down on and maybe some fermented beverages to dull the pain. Imagine going to the dentist today and being told that instead of Novocaine, you're getting a shot of whiskey and a leather strap to clench between your teeth while they operate on your brain with power tools. Archaeological evidence shows that people were getting their heads drilled open as far back as 6,500 BCE, which means that literally since the dawn of civilization, humans have been convinced that the solution to mental health problems was amateur brain surgery. Skulls have been found with multiple trepanation holes, suggesting that some people went back for repeat procedures, which raises the question of whether they kept going back because it actually helped, or because the first hole had scrambled their brains enough that they couldn't remember how terrible the experience was. The Maya civilization was particularly enthusiastic about trepanation, and they developed it into an art form with elaborate ceremonies and rituals surrounding the procedure. Mayan priests would perform trepanation not just for medical reasons, but also for religious purposes, believing that holes in the skull would allow divine spirits to enter and possess the patient. So not only were they drilling holes in people's heads to cure illness, they were also doing it to invite supernatural entities to move in and take over their brains, which seems like the kind of medical advice you'd get from someone who had recently undergone trepanation themselves. Medieval European physicians embraced trepanation with their typical enthusiasm for procedures that combined maximum pain with minimum understanding of human anatomy. They used it to treat everything from epilepsy to depression to what they called melancholia, which was basically their catch-all term for any behavior they didn't understand. Medieval medical texts contain detailed instructions for trepanation, including diagrams showing the best locations to drill based on the patient's symptoms. Got a migraine? Drill here. Acting strangely? Try drilling over there. Can't sleep? Definitely need a hole right in this spot. It was like acupuncture, except instead of tiny needles, they were using drills and saws on your skull. The survival rates for trepanation were actually surprisingly high, which is both amazing and terrifying. Archaeological evidence suggests that many patients not only survived the procedure but lived for years afterward, with their skull bones showing signs of healing around the drill holes. This means that medieval surgeons were somehow successfully performing brain surgery with primitive tools and no understanding of infection, sterilization, or proper surgical technique. It's like discovering that people in the Middle Ages were regularly performing heart transplants using kitchen knives and somehow not killing everyone in the process. Alright, we've covered drinking urine and drilling holes in heads, but now we're about to enter the absolute pinnacle of medical horror, the moment when ancient physicians looked at human feces and thought, you know what this patient needs? A nice steaming bowl of literal crap. Yes, we're talking about coprophagic medicine, where the prescription was actually, eat shit and live, except they meant it completely literally and charged money for the privilege. If you thought urine therapy was bad, just wait until you hear about the medical traditions that involved consuming human waste as a cure-all for pretty much everything that could possibly go wrong with the human body. Ancient Egyptian physicians were absolutely convinced that human feces contained powerful healing properties, and they developed an entire pharmaceutical system around different types of waste products. They had elaborate classifications for feces based on the diet, age, and health status of the donor, because apparently when you're prescribing literal crap as medicine, quality control becomes very important. Egyptian medical papyri contain detailed recipes for fecal preparations, including instructions for mixing human waste with honey, milk, and various herbs to make it more palatable, which is like trying to improve the taste of garbage by adding sugar and sprinkles. They believed that fresh feces from healthy young people was the premium grade medicine, while older or diseased waste products were considered lower quality therapeutic options. Imagine being an ancient Egyptian pharmacist and having to maintain quality standards for your human waste inventory, checking expiration dates, testing freshness, and probably having very awkward conversations with suppliers about their dietary habits and digestive health. The Chinese took fecal medicine to an even more sophisticated level of disgusting. Traditional Chinese medicine developed something called yellow dragon soup, which was literally a broth made from human feces that was prescribed for severe digestive disorders. The preparation involved fermenting fresh human waste for specific periods of time, straining it through cloth, and serving it as a medicinal tea. They also created golden syrup, which was concentrated human waste mixed with honey and herbs, because apparently the ancient Chinese believed that the best way to fix your stomach problems was to add more problematic material to your digestive system. Chinese physicians wrote extensive treatises on the proper selection and preparation of medicinal feces, including detailed instructions about the ideal donor characteristics, optimal fermentation times, and dosing schedules. They had specific recommendations for using feces from children versus adults, healthy versus sick individuals, and even different preparations based on the donor's gender and diet. It was like they were running a sophisticated pharmaceutical operation, except their active ingredient was something that modern humans flush down the toilet. European physicians during the medieval period also embraced fecal therapy with their typical enthusiasm for disgusting medical practices. They used human waste to treat everything from digestive problems to skin conditions to respiratory infections. Medieval medical texts contain recipes for fecal poultices, where human waste was mixed with various ingredients and applied directly to wounds or areas of infection. Because apparently medieval doctors looked at open wounds and thought, you know what this needs? Some nice fresh human waste to really get the healing process started. The confidence these physicians had in fecal medicine was absolutely mind-boggling. They wrote detailed scientific explanations for why human waste was effective medicine, usually involving complex theories about balancing bodily humors or transferring vital essences from healthy individuals to sick patients. Some physicians believed that consuming feces from healthy people would transfer their vitality and strength to the patient, which is basically like thinking you can download someone's health status by eating their waste products. Others thought that human waste contained concentrated healing spirits that could drive away disease and restore balance to the body. The preparation methods for fecal medicine were as elaborate as they were revolting. Physicians would dry human waste in the sun, grind it into powder, mix it with various liquids, or ferment it for weeks to concentrate its supposed medicinal properties. Some recipes called for aging feces in underground chambers for months, while others required fresh waste that was still warm from the donor. There were specific instructions for collecting, storing, and processing human waste that read like cooking recipes, except the main ingredient was something that should never, under any circumstances, be anywhere near food preparation areas. Alright, we've covered drinking urine and drilling holes in heads, but now we're about to enter the absolute pinnacle of medical horror, the moment when ancient physicians looked at human feces and thought, you know what this patient needs? A nice steaming bowl of literal crap. Yes, we're talking about coprophagic medicine, where the prescription was actually, eat shit and live, except they meant it completely literally and charged money for the privilege. If you thought urine therapy was bad, just wait until you hear about the medical traditions that involved consuming human waste as a cure-all for pretty much everything that could possibly go wrong with the human body. Ancient Egyptian physicians were absolutely convinced that human feces contained powerful healing properties, and they developed an entire pharmaceutical system around different types of waste products. They had elaborate classifications for feces based on the diet, age, and health status of the donor, because apparently when you're prescribing literal crap as medicine, quality control becomes very important. Egyptian medical papyri contain detailed recipes for fecal preparations, including instructions for mixing human waste with honey, milk, and various herbs to make it more palatable, which is like trying to improve the taste of garbage by adding sugar and sprinkles. They believed that fresh feces from healthy young people was the premium grade medicine, while older or diseased waste products were considered lower quality therapeutic options. Imagine being an ancient Egyptian pharmacist and having to maintain quality standards for your human waste inventory, checking expiration dates, testing freshness, and probably having very awkward conversations with suppliers about their dietary habits and digestive health. The Chinese took fecal medicine to an even more sophisticated level of disgusting. Traditional Chinese medicine developed something called yellow dragon soup, which was literally a broth made from human feces that was prescribed for severe digestive disorders. The preparation involved fermenting fresh human waste for specific periods of time, straining it through cloth, and serving it as a medicinal tea. They also created golden syrup, which was concentrated human waste mixed with honey and herbs, because apparently the ancient Chinese believed that the best way to fix your stomach problems was to add more problematic material to your digestive system. Chinese physicians wrote extensive treatises on the proper selection and preparation of medicinal feces, including detailed instructions about the ideal donor characteristics, optimal fermentation times, and dosing schedules. They had specific recommendations for using feces from children versus adults, healthy versus sick individuals, and even different preparations based on the donor's gender and diet. It was like they were running a sophisticated pharmaceutical operation, except their active ingredient was something that modern humans flush down the toilet. European physicians during the medieval period also embraced fecal therapy with their typical enthusiasm for disgusting medical practices. They used human waste to treat everything from digestive problems to skin conditions to respiratory infections. Medieval medical texts contain recipes for fecal poultices, where human waste was mixed with various ingredients and applied directly to wounds or areas of infection. Because apparently medieval doctors looked at open wounds and thought, you know what this needs? Some nice fresh human waste to really get the healing process started. The confidence these physicians had in fecal medicine was absolutely mind-boggling. They wrote detailed scientific explanations for why human waste was effective medicine, usually involving complex theories about balancing bodily humors or transferring vital essences from healthy individuals to sick patients. Some physicians believed that consuming feces from healthy people would transfer their vitality and strength to the patient, which is basically like thinking you can download someone's health status by eating their waste products. Others thought that human waste contained concentrated healing spirits that could drive away disease and restore balance to the body. The preparation methods for fecal medicine were as elaborate as they were revolting. Physicians would dry human waste in the sun, grind it into powder, mix it with various liquids, or ferment it for weeks to concentrate its supposed medicinal properties. Some recipes called for aging feces in underground chambers for months, while others required fresh waste that was still warm from the donor. There were specific instructions for collecting, storing, and processing human waste that read like cooking recipes, except the main ingredient was something that should never, under any circumstances, be anywhere near food preparation areas. If you thought mercury poisoning was the peak of medical insanity, just wait until we dive into how historical medicine treated women's health. This is where medical ignorance meets centuries of misogyny to create a perfect storm of treatments that were so spectacularly wrong that they make drinking urine look like cutting-edge science. For most of human history, physicians who were almost exclusively men, by the way, looked at women's bodies and decided that basically everything about female biology was either a disease that needed curing or a source of magical healing powers that could be harvested for everyone else's benefit. It was like having car mechanics who had never seen a car trying to fix engines based on their experience with washing machines, except the consequences were significantly more horrifying. Ancient physicians were absolutely fascinated by menstrual blood, but not in any way that would be considered remotely scientific or helpful. They developed elaborate theories about menstruation that ranged from women are basically sick for 1 week every month, to menstrual blood contains powerful magical properties that can cure diseases in other people. Egyptian physicians believed that menstrual blood was simultaneously toxic and therapeutic, depending on how you used it. They would prescribe menstrual blood mixed with various ingredients as a cure for skin conditions, eye problems, and digestive disorders, but they also warned that menstruating women were dangerous to be around because their blood could spoil wine, kill plants, and make men sick just by proximity. It's like thinking that someone is simultaneously a walking pharmacy and a biological weapon, which is the kind of logical consistency we've come to expect from historical medicine. Medieval European physicians took the concept of menstrual blood as medicine to absolutely horrifying extremes. They believed that virgins' menstrual blood was the most potent healing substance in existence, which led to some deeply disturbing medical practices. They also thought that menstrual blood from different types of women had different therapeutic properties. Blood from young women was good for rejuvenation, blood from mothers was useful for fertility treatments, and blood from older women was prescribed for wisdom-related ailments, because apparently medieval doctors thought human biology worked like a fantasy role-playing game where different character classes had different magical abilities. But the real pinnacle of gynecological medical ignorance was the concept of female hysteria, which was basically the medical establishment's way of saying women are crazy and it's probably something to do with their reproductive organs. For over 2,000 years, physicians attributed virtually any behavior in women that men didn't understand or approve of to hysteria caused by a wandering womb. Yes, they literally believed that the uterus could move around inside a woman's body like some kind of internal nomad, and that most female health problems were caused by this organ getting lost and ending up in the wrong place. The treatments for hysteria were exactly as ridiculous as you'd expect from a medical theory based on the idea that internal organs have a tendency to wander off and go sightseeing inside the human body. Ancient Greek physicians recommended marriage and pregnancy as cures for hysteria, because they thought regular sexual activity would keep the womb properly positioned. Roman doctors prescribed strong-smelling substances to be inhaled or applied to various body parts, believing that pleasant smells would attract the wayward womb back to its proper location, while unpleasant odors would repel it from wherever it had incorrectly settled. Medieval physicians developed even more creative treatments, including physical manipulation, herbal remedies, and various forms of what can only be described as medical torture designed to shock the uterus back into proper alignment. The confidence with which male physicians diagnosed and treated conditions they had absolutely no understanding of is truly breathtaking. They wrote detailed medical texts describing the symptoms of hysteria, which included basically any behavior that deviated from their narrow expectations of how women should act. Feeling sad? Hysteria. Too happy? Definitely hysteria. Speaking up in conversations? Classic case of wandering womb syndrome. Wanting to do anything other than quietly managing a household? Obviously the uterus has migrated to the brain and is causing confusion. They had elaborate classification systems for different types of hysteria, specific treatment protocols for various symptoms, and detailed theories about how female reproductive organs functioned, all based on zero actual knowledge and maximum confidence speculation. Just when you think we've reached the absolute bottom of medical absurdity, along comes one of the most spectacularly bizarre chapters in pharmaceutical history, the European obsession with grinding up ancient Egyptian mummies and eating them as medicine. Yes, you heard that correctly. For over 500 years, Europeans were literally consuming dead ancient Egyptians and calling it healthcare. It's like if someone today decided that the secret to good health was grinding up ancient Greek statues and snorting the marble dust, except somehow even more disrespectful to both the dead and basic human decency. This wasn't just a weird fringe practice either. Mummy powder was sold in every respectable pharmacy across Europe, prescribed by licensed physicians, and consumed by everyone from peasants to royalty as a cure-all for practically every ailment imaginable. The whole mummy medicine craze started during the medieval period when European physicians got their hands on some Arabic medical texts that mentioned something called mumia, which was actually a natural bitumen substance found in Persia that had legitimate medicinal properties. But instead of bothering to understand what they were reading, European doctors looked at the word mumia, noticed that it sounded like mummy, and concluded that the Persians were obviously talking about Egyptian mummies. It's like playing the world's most dangerous game of telephone, where a translation error leads to centuries of cannibalism disguised as medicine. European merchants quickly realized there was serious money to be made in the mummy business, so they started traveling to Egypt to purchase ancient corpses from tomb robbers and grave diggers. Egypt became essentially a body farm for European pharmaceutical companies, with professional mummy dealers who would strip ancient burial sites and sell the contents to European merchants who would ship them back home to be processed into medicine. Imagine explaining your job as international ancient corpse dealer at medieval dinner parties. It was probably still less horrifying than being a physician who prescribed human remains as daily vitamins. The preparation methods for mummy medicine were exactly as revolting as you'd expect. European apothecaries would grind the desiccated corpses into powder, mix them with various herbs and oils, or brew them into liquid extracts. Some pharmacies specialized in different grades of mummy powder based on the age and preservation quality of the corpses, because apparently when you're in the business of selling dead people as medicine, quality control becomes very important. Premium mummy powder came from well-preserved ancient pharaohs, while budget options were made from more recent corpses that had been artificially aged to look ancient. It was like a macabre version of wine tasting, except instead of vintage years, they were rating corpse freshness and mummification techniques. The medical establishment developed elaborate theories about why mummy powder was effective medicine, usually involving complex explanations about how the preservation process concentrated vital life forces that could be transferred to living patients. Physicians claimed that eating ancient Egyptian mummies would grant you the longevity and wisdom of the pharaohs, which is basically like thinking you can absorb someone's life experience by consuming their physical remains. Some doctors specialized in prescribing different types of mummy powder for specific conditions: pharaoh powder for leadership problems, priest powder for spiritual ailments, and common citizen powder for everyday health maintenance. The demand for mummy medicine became so high that Egypt literally started running out of ancient mummies to export. Enterprising merchants began creating fake mummies by taking recently deceased bodies, coating them with pitch and spices, and aging them in ovens to simulate the mummification process. So not only were Europeans eating ancient dead people, they were also unknowingly consuming recently dead people who had been artificially processed to look ancient. It was like a medieval version of food fraud, except instead of fake honey or watered-down wine, people were buying counterfeit corpses from sketchy dealers who were essentially running illegal human processing facilities. The practice continued well into the 18th century, long after it should have been obvious that eating ancient corpses wasn't actually improving anyone's health. European physicians wrote detailed treatises on the proper dosing and preparation of mummy medicine, with specific recommendations for different age groups and medical conditions. They had elaborate classification systems for different types of mummy powder, detailed instructions for detecting fake versus authentic ancient remains, and complex theories about which Egyptian dynasties produced the most therapeutically valuable corpses. The confidence with which they prescribed human remains as medicine is absolutely staggering when you consider that these were supposed to be the most educated and rational people of their time. If eating ancient corpses wasn't quite disturbing enough for you, let's dive into what might be the most horrifying medical practice in human history: the systematic removal or destruction of people's reproductive organs as a treatment for mental illness, behavioral problems, and basically any condition that physicians didn't understand. This is where historical medicine really showed its true colors, combining medical ignorance with social control to create treatments that were essentially legalized torture disguised as healthcare. For centuries, physicians across multiple civilizations looked at people exhibiting unusual behavior and concluded that the obvious solution was to chemically or physically destroy their ability to reproduce, because apparently the medical establishment thought that mental illness was caused by overactive reproductive organs that needed to be permanently shut down. The logic behind castration as medical treatment was spectacularly wrong in every possible way. Ancient physicians believed that sexual desire and reproductive function were directly connected to mental stability, so they reasoned that removing or disabling someone's reproductive capacity would automatically cure any psychological problems they might be experiencing. It's like thinking that the best way to fix a car's engine problems is to remove the steering wheel. There's no logical connection between the two systems, but if you're confident enough in your ignorance, anything seems like it might work. Greek and Roman physicians were particularly enthusiastic about castration as a cure for what they called excessive passions and moral disorders. They developed elaborate theories about how sexual energy interfered with rational thinking, and they prescribed castration for everything from epilepsy to homosexuality to simple disobedience in slaves and servants. Roman medical texts contain detailed instructions for both surgical and chemical castration procedures, with specific recommendations for different types of patients based on their age, social status, and the severity of their supposed mental illness. Medieval European physicians expanded the practice to include women, developing horrifying procedures for what they called female castration, that involved removing or destroying reproductive organs to treat hysteria, melancholia, and any behavior that men found threatening or incomprehensible. Medieval medical texts described these procedures with the same clinical detachment you'd expect from instructions for removing a splinter, except they were talking about permanently mutilating people's bodies based on completely fictional medical theories. The chemical methods were somehow even more horrifying than the surgical ones. Physicians would use various toxic substances to destroy reproductive tissue, including applications of caustic chemicals, injections of poisonous compounds, and ingestion of substances that would cause permanent organ damage. They had recipes for chemical castration that read like instructions for creating biological weapons, with detailed descriptions of how to mix various toxic ingredients to achieve maximum reproductive system destruction while keeping the patient alive long enough for the treatment to be considered successful. But here's what makes this practice particularly infuriating: it wasn't just targeting people with genuine mental illness. Physicians would recommend castration for women who were too outspoken, slaves who were disobedient, children who didn't conform to expected behavioral patterns, and basically anyone whose behavior challenged social norms or authority figures. It was a medical system that weaponized surgery and chemistry to enforce conformity and punish people for being different, all while claiming to be providing therapeutic treatment for their own benefit. The confidence these physicians had in castration as medical treatment is absolutely staggering. They wrote extensive medical treatises defending the practice, developed elaborate classification systems for determining which patients were good candidates for reproductive organ removal, and created detailed follow-up protocols for monitoring patients after they'd been permanently mutilated. They had specific guidelines for surgical techniques, post-operative care, and dosing schedules for chemical castration, all presented with the same scientific authority you'd expect from legitimate medical procedures. Some physicians specialized exclusively in castration procedures, becoming known as experts in what they called reproductive therapy, and traveling between cities to perform these operations on patients whose families or communities had decided they needed to be cured of their unacceptable behavior. The practice continued well into the modern era, with some countries legally mandating castration for various categories of criminals and mental patients until shockingly recently in human history. European and American physicians in the 19th and early 20th centuries were still performing these procedures based on theories about criminal behavior, mental illness, and social deviance that were only slightly more sophisticated than medieval ideas about wandering wombs and evil spirits. The transition from religious explanations for unusual behavior to supposedly scientific medical explanations didn't actually improve the treatment. It just gave physicians more tools for implementing the same brutal practices with an air of modern authority. Now we're going to talk about a medical practice that somehow managed to combine child endangerment with drug dealing, all while being considered perfectly normal family healthcare for over 200 years. Welcome to the wonderful world of pediatric opium therapy, where the solution to crying babies and restless children was to give them enough narcotics to sedate a horse. For centuries, parents across Europe and America were literally drugging their infants into unconsciousness and calling it responsible childcare, while physicians were prescribing addictive substances to toddlers as confidently as modern doctors prescribe children's vitamins. The whole pediatric opium craze started innocently enough, with physicians noticing that opium was effective at stopping pain and inducing sleep in adults. So naturally, they concluded that if opium worked for big people, it would obviously work even better for little people, because apparently 18th century medical logic operated on the principle that children were just tiny adults who required proportionally smaller doses of the same dangerous substances. It's like deciding that because alcohol helps adults relax, the best way to calm down a crying baby is with a shot of whiskey. Technically, the reasoning follows a certain internal logic, but only if you completely ignore everything important about how biology actually works. European pharmacies began producing special soothing syrups and baby cordials that were essentially liquid opium marketed specifically for children. These products had cheerful names like Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup, Godfrey's Cordial, and Mother Bailey's Quieting Syrup, which sound like they should be wholesome old-fashioned remedies for teething pain, but were actually powerful narcotic preparations that contained enough opium to knock out an adult. The marketing for these products was absolutely shameless. Advertisements promised that these syrups would instantly quiet fussy babies, help children sleep through the night, and provide relief from teething pain, all while completely failing to mention that the active ingredient was a highly addictive substance that could easily kill small children. American physicians embraced pediatric opium therapy with their typical enthusiasm for medical practices that seemed to solve problems quickly without requiring any actual understanding of underlying causes. They prescribed opium-based medications for everything from colic to restless sleep to general fussiness, essentially turning an entire generation of children into tiny drug addicts before they were old enough to walk. Medical textbooks contain detailed dosing instructions for infants and children, with specific recommendations based on age and weight, as if they were providing scientific guidance for a legitimate medical treatment rather than instructions for systematically drugging children into compliance. The effects of these opium-based children's medicines were exactly what you'd expect from giving powerful narcotics to developing nervous systems. Children who received regular doses of soothing syrups would become lethargic, unresponsive, and completely dependent on the medication to function normally. Many infants who were given these preparations would sleep for unnaturally long periods, fail to gain weight properly, and show signs of what we now recognize as classic drug withdrawal symptoms when the medication was stopped. But instead of recognizing these as signs of poisoning and addiction, physicians and parents interpreted them as evidence that the children needed their medicine and required larger or more frequent doses. The business of manufacturing and selling opium-based children's medicine became incredibly profitable, with pharmaceutical companies specifically targeting worried parents with advertising campaigns that played on their fears about sleepless nights and difficult children. These companies would hire physicians to write testimonials about the safety and effectiveness of their products, creating what was essentially a drug cartel that operated with complete legal authority and medical endorsement. Some companies even marketed different strengths of opium preparations for different age groups, offering infant formula, toddler strength, and children's regular versions, as if they were providing a comprehensive pediatric healthcare system rather than a range of narcotic products designed to incapacitate children of various sizes. The most horrifying part of this whole situation was how normalized it became in everyday family life. Parents would casually give their children opium-based medications for minor complaints, use them as regular sleep aids, and even pack them for travel to keep children quiet during long journeys. Nannies and childcare workers were trained to administer these preparations as part of routine childcare, and many families considered them as essential as food and clothing for proper child rearing. It was like an entire society had collectively decided that the best approach to parenting was to keep children in a drug-induced stupor, and somehow convinced themselves that this was both normal and beneficial for childhood development. Just when you think historical medicine couldn't possibly get any more dangerous, along comes the early 20th century with what might be the most spectacularly misguided health craze in human history: the brilliant idea that radioactive materials were actually good for you and should be consumed regularly as health tonics. Yes, we're talking about a time when people were literally drinking radioactive water, wearing radioactive jewelry, and sitting in radioactive chambers, all while convinced they were getting the ultimate health treatment. It's like discovering fire and immediately deciding the best use for it is as a refreshing beverage, technically impressive from a scientific standpoint, but absolutely horrifying in terms of practical application. The whole radioactive health craze started in the early 1900s when scientists first discovered radioactivity and noticed that these mysterious rays could affect living tissue. Instead of approaching this discovery with appropriate caution and extensive research, entrepreneurs and physicians immediately jumped to the conclusion that anything powerful enough to affect human cells must obviously be beneficial in small doses. It's the same logic that leads people to think that because vitamins are good for you, taking massive doses of vitamins must be even better, except instead of vitamins, they were dealing with substances that could literally destroy their DNA at the molecular level. The most popular radioactive health product was something called radium water, which was exactly what it sounds like: regular drinking water that had been infused with radium to make it radioactive. Companies like the Radium Water Company marketed this stuff as a cure-all that could treat everything from arthritis to depression to sexual dysfunction. Their advertising claimed that drinking radioactive water would restore youth, increase energy, improve mental clarity, and basically turn you into a superhuman, all while completely ignoring the fact that they were essentially selling people poison in a bottle with a fancy label. American physicians embraced radioactive medicine with their typical enthusiasm for treatments that seemed cutting-edge and scientifically advanced. They prescribed radium water for patients with chronic fatigue, prescribed radioactive suppositories for digestive problems, and recommended radioactive bath salts for skin conditions. Medical journals published papers about the therapeutic benefits of controlled radiation exposure, and physicians would write prescriptions for specific doses of radioactive materials as confidently as they prescribed aspirin. Some doctors even installed radium emanation devices in their offices, where patients could sit in small chambers and breathe radioactive gases as a form of respiratory therapy. The business of manufacturing and selling radioactive health products became incredibly profitable, with companies producing everything from radioactive toothpaste to radioactive cosmetics to radioactive chocolate. There was something called radium butter, that was regular butter mixed with radioactive materials, radium bread, that was baked with radioactive flour, and even radium cigarettes, that were marketed as a healthy alternative to regular tobacco because the radioactive additives supposedly counteracted the harmful effects of smoking. It was like an entire industry had collectively decided that the solution to all health problems was to add more radiation to everything people consumed on a daily basis. Wealthy customers could purchase personal radium devices for home use, including radioactive water fountains, radioactive beauty masks, and radioactive exercise equipment. Some luxury spas offered radium treatments, where customers would soak in radioactive hot springs or receive radioactive mud baths, paying premium prices for the privilege of exposing themselves to dangerous levels of radiation while thinking they were getting the finest healthcare money could buy. The most famous case was Eben Byers, a wealthy American socialite who drank multiple bottles of radium water daily for years because his doctor told him it would improve his health and vitality. Byers became a poster child for radioactive medicine, giving interviews about how wonderful he felt and how much the treatments had improved his life, right up until his jaw literally fell off and he died of radiation poisoning. When investigators examined his body, they found that his bones were so radioactive they were glowing in the dark, which should have been a pretty clear indication that maybe, just maybe, drinking radioactive water wasn't actually the health miracle everyone thought it was. But even after high-profile deaths from radiation poisoning, the radioactive health industry continued operating for decades, with companies simply reducing the radioactive content of their products and claiming they had perfected the ideal therapeutic dosage. Now we're going to talk about what is arguably the most horrifying medical procedure ever invented, a surgery so spectacularly misguided that it managed to win a Nobel Prize while simultaneously destroying thousands of lives and turning functional human beings into living zombies. Welcome to the world of lobotomy, where the solution to mental illness was to take an ice pick, shove it through someone's eye socket, and scramble their brain until they stopped being inconveniently human. This wasn't some ancient barbaric practice either. This was happening in modern hospitals with full medical approval well into the 1970s, which means there are people alive today who witnessed physicians casually performing amateur brain surgery with tools you could buy at a hardware store. The lobotomy was invented by a Portuguese neurologist named Antonio Egas Moniz, who looked at patients with mental illness and concluded that the problem was obviously too much brain activity in the frontal lobe. His solution was beautifully simple in its complete wrongness. If the frontal lobe was causing problems, just cut the connections and turn it off permanently. It's like deciding that your car radio is too loud and fixing it by taking a sledgehammer to the entire dashboard. Technically it solves the immediate problem, but only by destroying everything else in the process. Moniz won the Nobel Prize in Medicine for this procedure in 1949, which is probably the most embarrassing moment in Nobel Prize history, like giving someone an award for excellence in aviation right after they've crashed their plane into a hospital. But the real horror story begins with Walter Freeman, an American physician who took Moniz's procedure and decided it wasn't quite horrifying enough in its original form. Freeman developed what he called the transorbital lobotomy, which was essentially the ice pick method of brain surgery. He would take a tool that looked exactly like an ice pick, because it literally was an ice pick, insert it through the patient's eye socket above the eyeball, and then wiggle it around inside their brain until he felt like he'd done enough damage to achieve the desired personality changes. The whole procedure took about 10 minutes, required no surgical training, and could be performed in any doctor's office with minimal equipment. Freeman traveled around the country in what he called his lobotomobile, basically a medical van equipped with ice picks and electroshock equipment, performing lobotomies on anyone whose family thought they might benefit from having their personality surgically removed. He would show up at mental hospitals and offer to solve their overcrowding problems by performing mass lobotomies on difficult patients, promising to turn troublesome individuals into compliant, manageable people who would no longer require intensive care or supervision. It was like offering to solve traffic problems by disabling everyone's cars, technically effective, but only because you've removed people's ability to participate in normal life. The criteria for who needed a lobotomy were absolutely insane by any reasonable standard. Freeman and his colleagues would recommend the procedure for patients with depression, anxiety, homosexuality, disobedience in children, excessive emotionality in women, and basically any behavior that didn't conform to 1950s social expectations. They lobotomized people for being too sad, too happy, too talkative, too quiet, too independent, or too dependent. It was like they had decided that the ideal human was a person with no personality whatsoever, and they were willing to achieve that goal through amateur brain surgery. The effects of lobotomy were exactly what you'd expect from randomly destroying parts of someone's brain with an ice pick. Patients would emerge from the procedure with severely diminished emotional capacity, inability to form meaningful relationships, loss of creativity and initiative, and what physicians euphemistically called emotional flattening. They were essentially creating human robots who could follow simple instructions but had lost everything that made them recognizably themselves. But instead of recognizing these devastating side effects as evidence that the procedure was a horrific mistake, physicians interpreted them as signs of successful treatment, because patients who had been lobotomized were indeed easier to manage and less likely to cause problems in institutional settings. Freeman personally performed over 3,000 lobotomies during his career, including one on President Kennedy's sister Rosemary, who went from being a vibrant young woman with learning disabilities to a person who could barely speak or care for herself. The most horrifying part is that Freeman genuinely believed he was helping these people, writing detailed case studies about his successful treatments and training other physicians in his techniques. He would bring reporters and photographers to document his procedures, posing for pictures with his ice pick while standing over unconscious patients, apparently convinced that he was demonstrating cutting-edge medical innovation rather than committing systematic brain damage on vulnerable people. If scrambling people's brains with ice picks wasn't quite horrifying enough for you, let's talk about a medical and beauty practice that managed to combine vanity with attempted murder in the most spectacularly dangerous way possible. For centuries, people were literally poisoning themselves with arsenic. Yes, the same arsenic that's famous for being one of history's favorite murder weapons, and they were doing it voluntarily for both medicinal and cosmetic purposes. It's like deciding that the best way to achieve a healthy glow is to slowly kill yourself with rat poison, which is essentially exactly what people were doing for over 400 years while convinced they were achieving peak health and beauty. The whole arsenic beauty craze started in the Renaissance when European women noticed that small doses of arsenic could make their skin look pale and translucent, which was considered the height of fashionable beauty at the time. Instead of recognizing that this pale, translucent appearance was actually the early stages of arsenic poisoning, society decided that this must be the secret to eternal youth and beauty. It's like thinking that the best way to achieve that coveted deathly pale look is to actually start dying, which is essentially what these women were doing every time they applied their arsenic-based cosmetics. Victorian women took arsenic beauty treatments to absolutely insane levels, consuming arsenic pills called arsenic complexion wafers that promised to give them perfect porcelain skin. These weren't just topical treatments either. Women were literally eating poison on a daily basis because they thought it would make them more attractive. The advertisements for these products were absolutely shameless, promising that regular arsenic consumption would eliminate freckles, prevent wrinkles, and give women the pale, ethereal beauty that men supposedly found irresistible. It was like a beauty industry that had decided the ideal customer was someone who wanted to look gorgeous in their coffin. But arsenic wasn't just a beauty treatment. Physicians were also prescribing it as medicine for an absolutely staggering range of conditions. Doctors recommended arsenic for everything from asthma to syphilis to depression, apparently convinced that a substance capable of killing people in large doses must obviously be therapeutic in smaller amounts. Medical textbooks contain detailed instructions for arsenic therapy, with specific dosing schedules and treatment protocols that were essentially guides for systematic poisoning disguised as legitimate healthcare. Some physicians specialized in arsenic treatments, developing elaborate theories about how controlled poisoning could cure various diseases by stimulating the vital forces and purifying the blood. The confidence these doctors had in arsenic therapy is absolutely mind-boggling when you consider that they were essentially prescribing murder weapon doses to sick people and expecting them to get better. European pharmaceutical companies began mass-producing arsenic-based medications with cheerful names like Fowler's Solution and Donovan's Solution, which contained concentrated arsenic mixed with various other ingredients to mask the taste and supposedly enhance the therapeutic effects. These products were sold over the counter in regular pharmacies, meaning that anyone could walk in and purchase enough poison to kill themselves and their entire family, all while thinking they were buying health and beauty products. The marketing for arsenic-based medicines was exactly as deceptive as you'd expect from an industry built around selling poison as healthcare. Companies would hire physicians to write testimonials about the miraculous healing properties of arsenic, publish before and after photographs showing the cosmetic benefits of regular arsenic consumption, and create elaborate scientific explanations for why controlled poisoning was actually beneficial for human health. Some advertisements even claimed that arsenic could cure cancer, prevent aging, and improve mental function, which is like claiming that setting yourself on fire will keep you warm, technically true in a very limited sense, but ultimately counterproductive for long-term survival. The side effects of regular arsenic consumption were exactly what you'd expect from deliberately poisoning yourself on a daily basis. People who used arsenic-based beauty products and medicines would develop skin problems, hair loss, digestive issues, neurological damage, and eventually organ failure, but instead of recognizing these as signs of poisoning, physicians and beauty experts interpreted them as evidence that the treatment was working and that patients needed higher doses to achieve better results. It was like watching someone slowly die and congratulating them on their progress toward optimal health. The most infamous case was probably the Styrian arsenic eaters of Austria, who had developed a cultural tradition of consuming increasingly large doses of arsenic as a form of health maintenance and social status. These people would gradually build up tolerance to doses that would kill a normal person, essentially turning themselves into walking examples of what happens when you convince an entire community that poison is medicine. Now we're going to explore what happens when physicians discover electricity and immediately decide that the best use for this revolutionary new technology is to shock the hell out of sick people until they either get better or stop complaining. Welcome to Victorian electrotherapy, where the medical establishment looked at lightning and thought, you know what would really help my patients? A controlled version of that natural phenomenon that kills people. For over a century, doctors were literally electrocuting patients as a standard medical treatment, all while convinced they were providing cutting-edge scientific healthcare rather than conducting elaborate torture sessions disguised as therapy. The whole electrotherapy craze began in the late 1700s when scientists first figured out how to generate and control electrical current. Instead of taking time to understand how electricity actually affected the human body, physicians immediately jumped to the conclusion that because electrical shocks could make dead frogs twitch, they must obviously be therapeutic for living humans. It's like watching someone get struck by lightning and deciding that the best medical treatment would be to recreate that experience in a controlled clinical setting, technically based on observable phenomena, but missing every important detail about why that might be a spectacularly bad idea. Victorian physicians developed an absolutely staggering variety of electrical devices designed to shock different parts of the human body for different medical conditions. They had electrical belts for back pain, electrical headbands for migraines, electrical gloves for arthritis, and let's just say they had electrical devices for parts of the body that probably shouldn't be subjected to electrical current under any circumstances. It was like someone had decided that the human body was essentially a broken appliance that could be fixed by applying the right amount of electrical stimulation to the malfunctioning components. The medical theories behind electrotherapy were beautifully elaborate in their complete wrongness. Physicians believed that illness was caused by electrical imbalances in the body, and that applying external electrical current would restore proper electrical function and cure diseases. They developed complex charts showing which types of electrical stimulation were appropriate for different conditions, with specific voltage recommendations, treatment durations, and electrode placement instructions that read like manuals for operating medieval torture devices. Some doctors specialized exclusively in electrotherapy, setting up clinics filled with electrical equipment that looked like it belonged in a mad scientist's laboratory rather than a medical facility. The range of conditions that Victorian physicians treated with electricity was absolutely mind-boggling. They used electrical shocks to treat depression, anxiety, hysteria, impotence, infertility, digestive problems, respiratory issues, skin conditions, and basically any medical complaint that walked through their office doors. Got a headache? Time for some electrical brain stimulation. Feeling tired? Obviously you need electrical muscle therapy. Having trouble sleeping? Clearly your nervous system requires electrical recalibration. It was like they had decided that electricity was a universal cure-all that could fix any problem with the human body, regardless of whether that problem had anything to do with electrical function. The equipment used for Victorian electrotherapy was exactly as terrifying as you'd expect from medical devices designed to deliberately shock people. Physicians used hand-cranked electrical generators, primitive battery systems, and various contraptions that generated electrical current through chemical reactions or mechanical friction. Some devices were designed to deliver constant low-level electrical stimulation, while others provided intense electrical shocks that could knock patients unconscious. The most popular devices were electrical baths, where patients would sit in metal tubs filled with electrified water, essentially turning themselves into human light bulbs while their doctors assured them this was perfectly safe and scientifically proven therapy. But the real pinnacle of Victorian electrical medicine was something called Frankenstein therapy, where physicians would use electrical stimulation to try to revive recently deceased patients. Doctors genuinely believed that applying the right combination of electrical shocks could restart vital functions and bring dead people back to life, which led to some absolutely horrifying experiments involving corpses, electrical equipment, and physicians who had apparently confused medical practice with Mary Shelley novels. The confidence these doctors had in electrical therapy was truly inspiring in the most disturbing way possible. They published detailed case studies documenting their electrical treatments, wrote scientific papers about the therapeutic benefits of controlled electrocution, and developed elaborate training programs to teach other physicians proper electrical stimulation techniques. Medical schools offered courses in electrotherapy, and becoming certified in electrical medicine was considered a mark of advanced scientific sophistication rather than evidence that you enjoyed shocking sick people for money. So after this absolutely horrifying tour through the worst of medical history, you're probably wondering how intelligent civilizations managed to get literally everything wrong about human health for thousands of years. How did respected physicians look at human waste and think medicine, look at toxic metals and think beauty treatment, and look at ice picks and think brain surgery? The answer is both simpler and more terrifying than you might expect. It's what happens when desperate humans try to solve complex problems without any understanding of the underlying science, and then convince themselves that whatever random solution they've stumbled upon must be working because, well, they really need it to work. The fundamental problem with historical medicine was that physicians were essentially flying blind in a world where they had no understanding of basic biology. Imagine trying to repair a computer when you think it's powered by tiny invisible demons who get angry when you don't feed them the right combination of mystical substances. That's basically what medical practice was like for most of human history, smart people making confident decisions based on completely fictional understanding of how human bodies actually function. They could see symptoms, but they had no idea what caused them, so they just made up explanations that sounded reasonable and then developed treatments based on those fictional explanations. The lack of scientific method was absolutely crucial to how these medical disasters developed and persisted for centuries. Modern medicine works because we test treatments systematically, compare results between different approaches, and change our methods when evidence shows they don't work. Historical physicians did none of that. They would try a treatment on a few patients, and if some of them survived, they'd conclude the treatment was effective and start prescribing it to everyone. They had no concept of control groups, statistical analysis, or the difference between correlation and causation. If someone got better after drinking urine, obviously the urine cured them, regardless of whether they might have recovered anyway or whether dozens of other urine-drinking patients had died horribly. But ignorance alone doesn't explain the persistence of these practices. There were also powerful social and economic forces that kept dangerous treatments alive long after it should have been obvious they weren't working. Physicians had invested their entire professional reputation in these methods, so admitting they were wrong would have meant admitting they'd been systematically harming people for their entire careers. Medical schools were teaching these techniques as established science. Pharmaceutical companies were making money selling poisonous substances as medicine, and entire industries had developed around practices like bloodletting and mummy powder. Changing medical practice wasn't just about admitting scientific error, it meant dismantling economic systems and challenging the authority of respected institutions. The desperation of sick people and their families also played a crucial role in perpetuating these horrible treatments. When someone you love is dying and conventional medicine isn't helping, you'll try literally anything that offers hope, no matter how ridiculous or dangerous it seems. Physicians exploited this desperation by offering confident explanations and promising cures, even when they had no idea what they were doing. Families would pay enormous amounts of money for treatments that made their loved ones worse, but as long as the doctor seemed knowledgeable and confident, they'd continue believing that the treatment must be helping somehow. Religious and cultural beliefs also reinforced many of these medical practices by providing supernatural explanations for illness and recovery. If diseases were caused by evil spirits or divine punishment, then medical treatments didn't need to make biological sense. They just needed to address the spiritual causes of illness. When someone recovered after receiving a bizarre treatment, it wasn't because of random chance or the body's natural healing ability, it was because the treatment had successfully driven away evil influences or restored divine favor. These belief systems made it almost impossible to evaluate medical treatments objectively, because any outcome could be explained in terms of spiritual forces rather than physical cause and effect. Perhaps most importantly, the complete absence of any understanding of germs, infection, and disease transmission meant that physicians were often making their patients sicker without realizing it. They would move from patient to patient without washing their hands, use the same instruments on multiple people, and create conditions that were perfect for spreading diseases while thinking they were providing sterile medical care. Many patients who died from failed treatments were actually dying from infections caused by the treatment process itself, but since physicians didn't understand germ theory, they had no way to recognize that their own procedures were killing people. So how did we get from a world where doctors prescribed human feces as medicine to a world where we can cure diseases with precisely engineered antibiotics, perform heart transplants, and treat cancer with targeted therapies? The transformation of medicine from systematic torture disguised as healthcare to actual scientific healing is probably the most dramatic change in human history, and it happened remarkably recently when you consider how long humans spent getting everything spectacularly wrong. The biggest revolution in medical history wasn't any single discovery, it was the development of the scientific method and the radical idea that medical treatments should actually be tested to see if they work before being prescribed to sick people. This might seem like common sense now, but for thousands of years, medical practice was based on authority, tradition, and whatever sounded reasonable to whoever happened to be in charge. The shift from "this treatment works because ancient texts say it works" to "this treatment works because we've tested it systematically and compared it to alternatives" represents a fundamental change in how humans approach problem solving. Modern medicine is built on the revolutionary concept that evidence should determine treatment, rather than confidence, tradition, or economic interest. The discovery of germ theory in the 19th century was absolutely crucial to transforming medicine from a profession that accidentally killed people into one that actually saved them. When physicians finally understood that invisible microorganisms caused disease, suddenly all those centuries of medical disasters started making sense. Of course, bloodletting didn't work. It weakened patients who needed strength to fight infections. Of course, applying human waste to wounds made things worse. It introduced more bacteria into already vulnerable tissue. Of course, mercury poisoning didn't cure syphilis. It was adding a second life-threatening condition to an already sick person. Germ theory didn't just explain why historical treatments failed, it provided a scientific foundation for developing treatments that actually worked. The development of anesthesia represents another massive leap from historical medical horror to modern healthcare. Imagine the psychological revolution involved in going from "medical treatment means excruciating pain that you'll just have to endure" to "we can make you completely unconscious so you won't feel anything." Surgery went from being a last resort that patients might not survive simply because of the trauma and shock, to being a precise tool for fixing problems inside the human body. The difference between medieval surgery performed on conscious patients with no pain relief and modern surgery performed under controlled anesthesia with sterile techniques is like the difference between medieval torture and precision engineering. Antibiotics might be the single most important medical advancement in human history, because they represent the first time humans could actually fight infectious diseases rather than just hoping the patient's immune system would win. Before antibiotics, minor infections could kill healthy adults, childbirth was incredibly dangerous because of infection risk, and any injury that broke the skin could potentially be fatal. The development of penicillin and other antibiotics didn't just save individual lives, it transformed human civilization by making it possible to survive injuries and infections that had been death sentences for all of human history. Modern diagnostic technology has also revolutionized medicine by making it possible to actually see what's happening inside patients rather than just guessing based on external symptoms. Medieval physicians had to diagnose internal problems by examining urine, feeling pulses, and making educated guesses about what might be wrong. Modern physicians can use X-rays, MRIs, blood tests, and dozens of other diagnostic tools to identify exactly what's causing a patient's symptoms before deciding on treatment. It's the difference between trying to fix a car engine while blindfolded versus having detailed blueprints and specialized tools for every component. The regulatory systems that govern modern medicine also represent a huge improvement over historical medical practice. Before government agencies started requiring safety and efficacy testing, anyone could claim to be a physician and sell any substance as medicine. The modern requirement that medications be proven safe and effective through clinical trials before being approved for human use means that patients are protected from the kind of systematic poisoning that characterized historical medicine. Modern physicians can't just decide that arsenic or mercury might be therapeutic, they have to prove their treatments work through rigorous scientific testing. Perhaps most importantly, modern medicine is based on the understanding that the human body is incredibly complex and that effective treatments require detailed knowledge of anatomy, physiology, biochemistry, and pharmacology. Historical physicians operated with essentially no understanding of how human bodies actually functioned, so their treatments were essentially random experiments performed on sick people. Modern medical education requires years of study about how the body works, how diseases develop, and how different treatments affect various biological systems, which means that modern physicians are making informed decisions rather than educated guesses based on fictional theories about human biology. So what can we learn from this absolutely horrifying journey through the medical disasters of human history? Beyond the obvious lesson that maybe we shouldn't take health advice from people who think human waste is medicine, there are some genuinely important insights about how humans make decisions, how we evaluate evidence, and why it's crucial to remain humble about what we think we know. The most important lesson from historical medicine is that confidence and authority are not the same thing as knowledge and competence. Every single physician we've talked about today was absolutely convinced they were providing the best possible medical care based on the most advanced scientific understanding of their time. They weren't evil people trying to hurt their patients. They were intelligent, well-educated professionals who genuinely believed that bloodletting, mercury poisoning, and brain scrambling were therapeutic interventions that would help sick people get better. The scary thing is that if you had lived in any previous era of human history, you probably would have trusted these doctors and followed their advice, because they were the medical experts and they seemed to know what they were doing. This should make us all a little more suspicious of confident claims that aren't backed up by solid evidence, especially when those claims involve complex subjects that require specialized knowledge to understand properly. The development of evidence-based medicine represents one of humanity's greatest intellectual achievements, but it's also a relatively recent innovation that we shouldn't take for granted. The idea that medical treatments should be tested systematically, compared to alternatives, and modified based on results seems obvious now, but it took thousands of years for humans to figure this out. The scientific method isn't just a useful tool for medical research, it's a fundamental approach to understanding reality that protects us from the kind of confident ignorance that characterized historical medicine. When we abandon evidence-based thinking in favor of tradition, authority, or wishful thinking, we're essentially reverting to the same mindset that gave us centuries of medical disasters. The importance of questioning authority and demanding evidence becomes especially relevant when we consider how many of history's worst medical practices were perpetuated by respected institutions and endorsed by influential experts. Medieval universities were teaching physicians to prescribe human waste as medicine. Government agencies were approving radioactive substances as health tonics. Medical journals were publishing papers about the therapeutic benefits of lobotomy. The lesson here isn't that we should distrust all medical authority, but rather that we should expect medical claims to be supported by solid evidence regardless of who's making them. Historical medicine also demonstrates the importance of intellectual humility and the willingness to admit when we're wrong. One of the reasons these horrific practices persisted for so long is that physicians were unwilling to acknowledge that their treatments weren't working. Instead of changing their methods when patients didn't improve, they would modify their theories to explain why the treatments were still correct despite the poor outcomes. Modern medicine works precisely because it's built on the principle that our understanding is always incomplete and subject to revision based on new evidence. Perhaps most importantly, the history of medical disasters should make us appreciate just how remarkable modern healthcare really is. We live in an era where diseases that killed millions of people throughout history can be cured with simple antibiotics, where complex surgeries can be performed with minimal risk, and where we can diagnose internal problems without cutting people open to look inside. This didn't happen by accident, it's the result of centuries of gradual progress based on systematic research, careful observation, and the willingness to abandon practices that don't work. The fact that we can take a pill and cure an infection that would have been a death sentence just 100 years ago represents an almost miraculous advancement in human knowledge and capability. But we should also remember that our current medical knowledge is still incomplete and will probably seem primitive to future generations. The physicians of 2023 are not the final authorities on human health any more than the physicians of 1623 were. Future medical historians will probably look back at some of our current practices with the same horror that we feel when looking at historical medicine. The difference is that we now have systematic methods for testing and improving our treatments, which means that medical progress can happen much faster and with fewer disasters along the way. The key is maintaining the scientific mindset that got us this far, questioning assumptions, demanding evidence, and remaining humble about the limits of our current understanding. If you thought tonight's journey through the horrifying world of historical medicine was disturbing, well, my night owl friends, we've only scratched the surface of medical madness throughout human history. Because what we've covered tonight, the urine drinking, the feces eating, the mercury poisoning, the brain scrambling, that was all just medicine and treatment. But there's a whole other category of medical horror that we haven't even touched yet, and it's somehow even more terrifying than everything we've discussed so far. I'm talking about surgery, actual cutting into human bodies with primitive tools, No understanding of anatomy, no anesthesia, no sterile techniques, and absolutely no idea what they were doing. The surgical nightmares of history make lobotomies look like precision medicine. We're talking about procedures that were so spectacularly dangerous and misguided that they make today's horror stories look like gentle massages. Picture this. It's medieval Europe and you've got a terrible stomachache that just won't go away. You go to the local surgeon, and remember, these were often the same people who cut hair and shave beards for a living, and his solution is to cut you open right there on a wooden table in front of a crowd of spectators, with no pain relief except maybe a shot of ale and a leather strap to bite down on. He's going to use tools that he also uses for carpentry. He's never washed his hands in his life, and his understanding of human anatomy comes from dissecting pigs and making wild guesses about how human insides might be different. Oh, and there's a very good chance he's never actually performed this particular procedure before, but he's confident he can figure it out as he goes along. The surgical techniques of historical medicine were essentially elaborate forms of public torture that occasionally, through sheer luck, didn't kill the patient immediately. We're talking about operations performed in dirty taverns by drunk men with rusty knives, surgical procedures that were considered successful if the patient lived long enough to pay the bill, and medical innovations that were basically just new and creative ways to cause maximum damage to human bodies while claiming to provide healing. And the confidence these surgeons had in their abilities was absolutely staggering. They would attempt to remove internal organs they'd never seen before, perform amputations with tools they'd borrowed from blacksmiths, and conduct experimental procedures on living patients based on theories they'd made up that morning. Next week, we're going to explore the absolute worst surgical nightmares in human history, and trust me when I say that if tonight's medicine made you queasy, next week's surgery stories are going to make you never want to see a sharp object again. We'll meet surgeons who thought the best way to remove kidney stones was to dig around inside someone's body with their bare hands until they found something that felt rocky. We'll discover operations that were performed by teams of people holding the patient down while one person sawed through bones with carpenter's tools. We'll learn about surgical procedures that had mortality rates so high that surviving the operation was considered a miraculous outcome rather than an expected result. And we'll explore the absolutely insane surgical innovations that physicians came up with when they decided that existing procedures weren't quite horrifying enough and needed to be made more creative and dangerous. We'll talk about the surgeon who performed the first recorded cesarean section on a conscious patient using kitchen knives, the medical team that decided to treat head injuries by removing pieces of skull with hammers and chisels, and the physicians who thought the best way to fix broken bones was to break them again in different places until they looked more symmetrical. We'll explore surgical anesthesia that consisted of hitting patients over the head with wooden clubs until they stopped moving, sterilization techniques that involved wiping surgical instruments on the surgeon's pants, and post-operative care that basically amounted to throwing patients in a corner and hoping for the best. And just like with today's medicine horror stories, these weren't random crazy people performing surgery in back alleys. These were respected medical professionals working in the finest hospitals of their time, using techniques that were taught in medical schools and endorsed by the most prestigious medical institutions in the world. So if you enjoyed tonight's tour through medical madness, make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on, because next week we're diving even deeper into the beautiful nightmare of historical healthcare. And for all you insomniacs out there, you might want to prepare some extra strong coffee, because what we're going to discover about historical surgery is definitely going to keep you awake. And there you have it, my fellow night owls and history enthusiasts. We've just completed one of the most disgusting, horrifying, and absolutely fascinating journeys through human medical history that you're ever likely to experience. If you made it through all 90 minutes of urine drinking, feces eating, mercury poisoning, brain scrambling, mummy consumption, and radioactive health tonics without either falling asleep or running away from your screen in horror, then congratulations, you've officially survived a comprehensive education in everything that can possibly go wrong when humans try to heal each other without understanding what they're doing. I hope you've gained a new appreciation for the simple miracle of modern medicine, and maybe developed a healthy skepticism for anyone who claims to have revolutionary health solutions that seem too good to be true. Before you drift off to sleep tonight, and after everything we've discussed, you might actually be able to sleep better knowing that you live in an era where doctors wash their hands and understand that germs exist. Let's take a moment to reflect on this incredible journey we've shared. We started with the innocent question of what the worst medicines in history were, and we ended up discovering that for most of human existence, going to the doctor was essentially a creative form of suicide. We learned that respected physicians once prescribed human waste as medicine, that beauty treatments involved slowly poisoning yourself with arsenic, and that the solution to mental illness was to scramble people's brains with ice picks. We discovered that people used to eat ancient Egyptian mummies as medicine, drink radioactive water as health tonics, and submit to electrical torture as therapeutic treatment. But most importantly, we learned that the development of scientific medicine represents one of humanity's greatest achievements, the triumph of evidence-based thinking over confident ignorance, systematic research over traditional authority, and careful observation over wishful thinking. If you enjoyed this deep dive into medical madness, then you absolutely need to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we're just getting started with our exploration of historical horror stories. Next week, we're diving into the nightmarish world of historical surgery, where we'll discover procedures that make everything we talked about tonight look like gentle spa treatments. We're talking about operations performed with carpentry tools, amputations conducted by drunk barbers, and surgical innovations that were essentially elaborate torture devices disguised as medical equipment. Trust me, if tonight's medicine stories kept you awake, next week's surgery stories are going to give you nightmares about sharp objects for the rest of your life. Make sure to like this video if you found it educational, entertaining, or at least memorably horrifying. Share it with anyone who complains about modern healthcare, because nothing puts contemporary medical inconveniences in perspective quite like learning about the good old days when medical treatment meant having your skull drilled open with primitive tools or being force-fed toxic metals until your teeth fell out. Leave a comment telling me which historical medical practice horrified you the most. Personally, I'm still trying to decide between the mercury treatments and the mummy consumption, but I have a feeling many of you will vote for the fecal medicine or the lobotomy procedures. For those of you who are insomniacs and night shift workers, I want to thank you for letting me be part of your late-night routine. There's something special about sharing these bizarre historical stories with people who are awake when the rest of the world is sleeping. Whether you're here because you couldn't sleep because you're working overnight, or because you just enjoy learning about the weirdest aspects of human history, I'm grateful that you chose to spend your time with me tonight. If you want to explore more historical horror stories, check out our playlist of medical disasters, historical catastrophes, and human folly throughout the ages. We've got videos about the worst surgical procedures ever attempted, the most dangerous beauty treatments in history, and the medical practices that were so bad they were eventually banned by law. Each video is designed to be both educational and entertaining, perfect for those late-night curiosity sessions when you want to learn something fascinating but disturbing. And remember, next week we're continuing this medical horror tour with the most insane surgeries ever performed, so make sure you're subscribed and ready for another journey into the beautiful nightmare of historical healthcare. Until then, sleep well knowing that you live in an age of antibiotics, anesthesia, and evidence-based medicine, and try not to think too much about what future medical historians might say about our current practices. Thanks for staying up late with me tonight, and I'll see you next week for another dose of historical horror that's guaranteed to keep you awake.